So, today's video is... Well, honestly, I'm re-recording it, so it might be slightly late going live, but it's going up today. And it's on building the fleets of Actium. So, I should expect to get a lot of people going, you are doing this because Rome is currently very popular and trending. I'm going to go, no. If we go through to this lovely thing I wrote right at the end of last year, you'll notice that the fleets of the Battle of Actium is scheduled for the 19th September. So I wrote this back in November 2022, roughly. If I knew what was going to be trending in September the following year, I don't know how to tell you this, but I would probably have played a lottery a few times, won, and whilst I'd still be publishing historical videos, it'd be from my own personal island, with my own department of robot servers, a massive library, and... oh, let's just admit it, there would be at least a couple of jet skis and the world's largest hot tub on that island, okay? Just the normal things. Probably not many other people. You know, they get in the way of me having my reading time. But lots and lots of naval history for me to read. So, that's going on. Great. Hopefully this video does well, and hopefully you enjoy it. Next thing, this video is going to be hot button topics. I'm not sure if I've already mentioned that, but yeah, I'm going to be talking about Cleopatra in this video. Believe it or not, she's important. And thanks to a Netflix series, which I have not, I will admit, seen, mainly because I don't have the time to watch a lot of programs, and so I checked the reviews first before I watched them, and most of the reviews were, yeah, interesting. So I'm going to be talking about Cleopatra. This is not, though, a debate on that program. I will say, and I will get this out the way at the beginning, Cleopatra was very intelligent and very capable. She wasn't always lucky, and she didn't always seem to always go with the right decision in front of her, and was often better, smarter in hindsight or in preparations. I will also add that the Ptolemaic family, whilst with every other ruling family of various places you can pick to, they would usually marry other royal families. The Ptolemies took what had been the previous pharaoh's policy to an extreme. Because the previous pharaohs had had a rather large, almost clan-like family they could draw from. So they had things like cousins they could go and have relations with. Ptolemies took the whole keeping it to the royal family to keep the royal family line pure thing. It was icky, okay? It was icky. Sisters, nieces, daughters, aunts, possibly relations even closer than that in terms of the female line, and I could go through the variations of the male ones. You know, sons, nephews, uncles, fathers. You know, yeah. So they're just icky. And the fact that, I'm just going to use that word, that the fact that Cleopatra didn't have two heads surprises me more than anything else. So that's all I'm going to say about anything to do with that. I just thought I'd get it over and done with, and then those people who wanted to see that can go away, and those people who want to see naval history can enjoy the naval history, because that's what this video is about. I'm a naval historian. That's what I focus on. So, building the fleets of the Battle of Actium. Well, this actually is going to go through a lot of slides before you get to the fleet. And I will say this, for a battle which reportedly involves somewhere in the region of 700 ships, our actual knowledge of those ships in terms of their exact quantities and qualities is interesting. There is a small issue also going on in that Quinquemarine, the 5 oarsman version of Trimarine, and standard for Hellenistic navies, especially post-Punic Wars navies in the Mediterranean, is also used as shorthand for warship. Later on in history, in Roman times, Liburna becomes shorthand for warship. And Liburna, the first... Well, this is the trouble. The Battle of Actium is sometimes listed as this is the first battle Liburna used. It's not. They used against Sextus Pompey in the putting down a Sicilian revolt. Liburna are smaller ships. They are really an advanced... Someone's taken a look at a Byrene. I did 2 sets of oarsmen, and thought, hang on, can we build this more efficiently and better for the oarsmen so they have greater range of motion? Because one of the troubles you have to think about when you're dealing with oarsmen is range of motion. And this is where it gets also interesting when we start, talking about the banks of oarsmen, because with a Quinquemarine, you have 5 oarsmen, and you have the banks of them going up along. And they're usually split up, we're fairly certain, between 3 oars. So it's a 2-2-1 scenario. But in this battle, you have... well, name it and it's probably there. Up until at least banks of 10. And those are interesting. Because you could theoretically have 2 sets of 5. But then the range of motion on the person who is the furthest inside oarsman is basically going to have to be running with the oar. Standing and running. Okay? There is someone going to be sitting. Probably the person who's the second oarsman in from the hull will still be sitting. They will probably have the most natural range of motion as we consider with rowing. But then there'll be someone who's crouching, someone who's standing, and someone who's running, pretty much, to deal with the range of motion of the oar. That doesn't really work. But if you go with 3 oars, well, you get a 3-3-4. That's still not gonna be good. And this is... the banks of oars are one of the things which we find most difficult to conceptualize in our minds. And this is the real problem when you start talking about building the fleets of Actium, etc. Because a lot of the base knowledge, which was standard knowledge at the time, is not existent to this day. Okay, that's made some people probably go, what? What are you saying? Here is the thing. To this day, currently, if you wanted to make a barrel for a 15-inch or 16-inch gun, in terms of a naval gun barrel, it would take a lot of work. It would take some forensic engineering study, forensic engineering of barrels which still exist, and we'd have to recreate whole processes and whole systems. So what you have written down is usually some of the knowledge, but a lot of that's written down in a way which references what was, at that time, general knowledge. Of course, we all understand it. We're all in this industry. We know what we're doing. We don't need to write that down because everyone knows that. And now we haven't made them for 60-odd years. Most of the people who had that general knowledge are dead. And, you can go back and say, well, we haven't made them for roughly nearly 70 years. Yeah, they're gone. They are long gone. Well, it's kind of like that when we go back to ancient technology. You see, when people develop a better method of doing something, i.e., building hulls or building or structuring ores or all sorts of things that is more efficient, more sensible use of manpower, all these things, of the crew, well, stuff gets forgotten. Because why are you holding on to that old knowledge? Who's going to sit down and record that all to preserve for future generations? And even if someone does the record survive? It's fun. So, shameless book plug. I like a shameless book plug. This is my book. This is the one which is out, and the second edition is coming out in October, which is going to be paperback version. I'm looking forward to it. I'm also looking forward to some other books for coming out, which I'm hopefully going to get all done and sorted out. As always, the trouble is, honestly, is arranging the pictures and getting the pictures. You can do the writing, you can do the research, but it's buying the rights to the pictures and using them, making sure you have the money to do that. Because it's not cheap. I've done whole videos on the costs of procuring photos, etc. for books, and if you want to go see them, please do. It explains a lot of the reasons why you often see the same pictures being used again and again in books, because those might be the ones which have the cheapest rights. I can do all this thanks to your support. It's thanks to you. Please note, this book was put together thanks to a credit card. Not the advance, not anything like that. It was literally done on a credit card. And I had just finished off paying off that credit card bill when I went to Australia earlier this year. I just finished off paying off that credit card. And the amounts left over from that time, from that the research trips which were necessary, from the purchasing the rights of photos, all those things. Yeah. But that was not fun. That was worrying. And that's the standard system for most academics. I'm hoping not to have to put anything on my credit cards currently for next generation, for next books coming through. But I am self-publishing 2 of them. The reason I'm doing that is because as much fun as I've had with publishing books with publishers, and this is the only one I've done, but I have worked on other ones and other projects that haven't actually come through yet, but I have worked with them. I really like the idea of self-publishing because I like the idea of not having to argue with people about phraseology and over sometimes some silly things. Having to explain things to people who are... It's going to sound so strange because I'm going to get the books read through by people who are not specialists. There's been very nicely, some people have volunteered through Discord, have gone, can we read it? We'll happily edit and read the books. And I'm going, thank you very much, please do. Others are my friends who I have a standing arrangement with. They are not naval historians by any stretch of imagination. But they are happy to read my books. In return, I have to buy them a Chinese takeaway. Or take them to a Chinese restaurant. For some reason, the deals with my family, deals with my friends and my family often involve Chinese food. Not sure why. That seems to be our currency, though. And so those books will hopefully come out this year. And hopefully you'll enjoy them all. But to the Battle of Actium. The books used for today that have supported a lot of today's work are 2 books which I was actually sent quite recently. Hellenistic Naval Warfare and Warships, 336 to 30 BC, War at Sea from Alexander to Actium by Michael Patassi. I wasn't expecting this book to come through. I didn't know this book was coming through. The fact it came through before I did this video was just amazingly helpful. So I have shamelessly used it. It's a very good book. It's worth a read. I will not call it the easiest book in the world to use, because it is trying to cover an absolutely immense topic in not much space. But the point of it is it's an introductory book. So it covers that space really, really well. The reason the places I would say that the reason I would call it easy is because the amount of times I was reading this book and then went, oh, good, and I'd really like to learn more about this. Then went to references, found there out of a book mentioned, another book mentioned, and would go off to that other book. So it's kind of like the book you read when you've got another 10 books to go to. And it will tell you which of those books to go to. It's brilliant for that. So it's a really good introduction to Hellenistic naval warfare and warships. And it's from Pen and Sword. So I have to admit, this is a review of a copy which has been sent to me for free. Now, Armies of the Roman Republic. Again, I think this is a Pen and Sword one. Yeah, it is. And it was, again, sent to me to review. And when you're sent a book to review, I still prefer this. And by the way, reviewers who are changing to purely sending out digital versions, why? It used to be always a nice thing. You got a copy of the book, so you could actually evaluate the book before you recommend it to someone. A digital version is not the same to evaluate as a book version. It allows me to see what this whole layout, this full picture looks like. And this is a really interesting book to have because you could go through the early armies and what they look like and what their troops look like. And this one even is good because it's managed to find the one of the few enactors in the world who actually, I'm not sure if you can see in this photo, looks positively glum like a sentry on duty. I mean, it's got accurate photos. Whereas this person looks like a sentry on duty, but again, looks almost happy to be there. Anyway, that's from Gabriel Esposito. Esposito. Both very good books. Really worth a read. So, Battle of Actium. You have a whole lot of propaganda and a whole lot of reality. So let's start off with this. There is ideas about dead water, which is when you have issues with the water flow, so much so that pretty much it slows down because of the current and the flow of the water, and it's sort of, especially you can get it in certain eddy positions. Your ships, especially road ships, can't really move at the same speed as others do. But more importantly, you have a lot of propaganda because this is one of the major periods of change in the Roman Empire. In what will be, in the Roman Empire. This is moving it from the Empire of the Republic to the Empire of the Emperors. And by that I mean, this has to be a big battle. It has to be a glorious battle. It has to be a victorious battle. And it's very important to the whole status of Octavian that he is seen to be victorious and glorious, and he is seen to be triumphant in every single way and exemplify the absolute greatest virtues of Rome in his glorious victory, and his opponents must be everything he is not. Because it is another civil war. Okay? It is another civil war in the Roman history. And again, I've seen again, I keep getting, this is coming up on various videos, especially in shorts at the moment, I keep getting videos about, whether the Roman Republic and Rome actually existed as an empire. It did. I'm sorry to people who say otherwise. It did. If you're in the UK, you can see many forts, and even Hadrian's Wall if you really want to go to it. Walking along Hadrian's Wall is quite fun, but there are lots of different parts of Rome which are still the Roman Empire, etc., which are still visible to this day. Whilst I think that currently, most recent one I said, recent one I saw said it's a myth propagated by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had enough issues going on in the medieval period without trying to randomly build Hadrian's Wall. For starters, the fact is Hadrian's Wall had been used for a long time prior to even the Catholic Church getting to Britain as a border. I'm not sure who else would build a wall in the Roman style in Britain other than the Romans. Honestly, most of the local populations liked to build things out of earth. Mainly because that suited their form of warfare pretty well. And you can make a very solid weapon system from it. Once you're dealing with large armies of maneuver and lines of logistics, etc., and you have roads, etc., the fortification systems and wall systems that the Romans like to use start to make a lot more sense. It's that thorny old word that comes up so often in this channel: infrastructure. And here again, we have another scenario in terms of infrastructure. One of the things that's often forgotten about is that in this battle particularly, Mark Antony, for all his glorious achievements, is really not good when it comes to logistics and infrastructure. That's something he leads to other people. And it's one of the interesting scenarios you have to deal with, and you can actually consider, is that the triumvirate which had originally been formed had included a guy called Lepidus. Now Lepidus is a really, really cool Roman general. He's made complete fun of in Shakespeare and all sorts of things because he's not good at politics and he's not necessarily the best at actually fighting battles. But that wasn't the role he'd been used for. He had been Caesar's logistician. He had been the person who would organize Caesar's logistics. That is why Caesar trusted him more often than Mark Antony, because he was an absolutely seamless bureaucrat. And even Octavian only got really rid of Lepidus when he had people to replace him. But that was also probably why he was completely outmaneuvered politically, because he would do things all in a nice plan, whereas, and try and take his time and do things methodically, like in a logistical infrastructure way, and the others would just go with what was available, take it, and then would have people like him trying to resolve the mess after they made it. You need both. Okay? So the triumvirate, and this is the second triumvirate, falls. They fall apart. Honestly, Mark Antony, Octavian, they're an interesting relationship from the get-go. And basically, the moment Caesarion, who is the son of Julius Caesar by Cleopatra, at least according to all the claims made at the time, and seems to be accepted by Caesar, so we'll go with it. Octavian saw him as a threat to his power in a republic, which was supposedly didn't have a ruling family and all these things. The son of Caesar, Julius Caesar, was considered a threat to Octavia, who was his acknowledged heir, but actually his nephew's power. Unfortunately, this all became muddled up in the joyous debate to this Rome and the mess for leadership and power. The triumvirate actually works quite well when they have regular contact with each other. They don't work that well when they are spread far apart from each other by the distances of the Roman Empire. I mean, who'd have foreseen that happening? when there's a constant war of whispers going on between their allies, and where each one has a sufficiently large enough court around them to make themselves look like MacArthur. I mean, the one who seems to have the least effect of this on them is Lepidus, but Lepidus is probably the least successful politician of them, so for some reason doesn't really attract the political types as much. He does achieve being Pontifex Maximus, which means he's the chief priest of Rome. That is a very important position to be in. And normally, under Roman Republic rules, that would be an extremely powerful position. But when Octavian and Mark Antony have most of the legions, because you've given some of yours to them to help them out, and they haven't returned them, it kind of is, I don't know, it makes you a very nice figurehead. So, propaganda versus reality. Mark Antony and his forces are in Greece, possibly heading to Italy. He's certainly got enough ground troops that, frankly, in a land battle, he could probably have fought it and won. And this is despite him apparently suffering losses from desertions. Again, the desertions, I think, can be overemphasized. And why am I saying the desertions can be overemphasized? Because we also know there's a lot of disease at the time. Desertions are a very nice way of getting around some issues. Oh, you weren't really our enemy, you deserted from them. Yes, I deserted. Yes, I deserted. And there were some quite, well, people like Quintus Dellius, who did actually switch sides before the battle, because apparently he didn't like Cleopatra or something or other, and gave Antony's battle plan to Octavian, which of course never hurts. That never hurts, you know. By the way, Quintus Dellius goes on to be a historian and write a history which doesn't survive to this day. We know others have referenced his history. We don't have his history. There you go. Good example of the stuff doesn't survive. It's annoying, but it doesn't. Ah, finally. N. Yay! So the official leaders are Augustus and Mark Antony. They are the official leaders of this battle. But there's a small problem with that. Mark Antony probably really is acting as his own commander-in-chief and organising his fleet. But he is the head of an alliance fleet. He has got some very, very mighty allies in there who are bringing some of the most powerful ships to bear. We'll be talking about those in a second. And Augustus is a very, very fine politician and a very capable bureaucrat. But he was never the world's best general. And he knew that. He knew that. And so, the real commanders of the battle. Well, Antony is there, but Cleopatra commands the largest group of reserve, the most powerful ships there, and her squadron of 60 ships is crucial. If those 60 ships had been able to enter the battle, they could have well changed the course of the battle. If they had been able to be deployed. However, Marcus Agrippa is Augustus's #1 general, admiral, commander. He is pretty much his key officer. And there is no surprise that he is the one put in charge directly of the force facing Antony, or Antonius as it's labelled on this map. Now, the other commanders. You have Aruntius, who again one of Octavian's commanders, a well-known and very good one. You have Taurus, who is commander of the land forces, and you have Lurius, who has the pleasure of having Octavian directly in his own force. Antony's forces are commanded by Sosius, or M. Octavius, who has no relation to Octavian, but does occasionally cause me some confusion, because I will sometimes say Octavius when I mean Octavian, because they are both in this battle, and at certain points they get quite close to each other. Great fun for a dyslexic historian. Yay! Especially someone who's reading off his notes and going, they have Octavian, oh, good lord. And then, so thank you, Rome, thank you for that. You know, this is another reason you can tell it's not made up, because in nicest way, if anyone was writing fiction, they use different names. Because it's easier for the author to remember. I say that now, and knowing Glyn Stewart, who occasionally watches this channel and does excellent, excellent science fiction books, he'll probably do an entire book where everyone has very similar names just to wind me up. But we'll leave that to one side. And the admiral, sort of the commander backing up Mark Antony, is Publicoa. And as mentioned, Cleopatra is in reserve, and Candidius is in charge of his army. Now the thing is, Antony has a larger army than Octavian, so he should probably have tried to force a land battle. But for some reason, Agrippa and Octavian had agreed not to fight a land battle. In fact, to basically keep Antony sealed up in the Ambracian Gulf until he came and fought his way out. Because they had a superiority in number of ships. And they had superiority in type of ships. And their ships also had a lot more experience of fighting. So their advantage was naval. Antony's advantage was land. Fighting the battle ashore, a land battle, especially if he pulled his marines off his ships, and probably pulled the rowers off the ships as well, because let's be honest, the rowers are going to be built. They're going to be tough. And again, please note, the rowers were not slaves. They were not slaves. This is one of those lovely things from Hollywood. The rowers are slaves. Once you realise, A, you have to feed them well, because otherwise your engines are going to run out of power. Food is their fuel, and you need those engines to be working fast. You cannot keep someone alive and pulling on fear and whipping them alone. Believe it or not, it doesn't work. And also, when you realise the sheer number of them on a ship versus the number of Marines, and the difficulties of controlling them, usually they are professionals. Sometimes they are prisoners who've been freed on the condition they go and become rowers. That is actually the case. Again, some slaves were freed to become rowers, but they were always free. Why? Try controlling a ship where your engines don't want to do what you want them to do. And even more fun, imagine what happens when you're boarded by the enemy. And oh yes, yeah, they're boarding us. We have 120 Marines, they have 120 Marines. Yeah, one's a free ship, one's got a ship where the rowers are all slaves. What's the first thing you do as a soldier when you jump on that ship? Whack the chains, free the slaves. Wonder who they'll fight for. The people who've been enslaving them and forcing them to row and whipping them, or the people who are coming along who will happily free them? I can't think who they would fight for. So, basically, their plan is to either wait for sickness and a lack of supplies to wipe out Antony, because he's brought all his troops together but then not managed to do much with them because he's kept finding squadrons in his way between Greece and Italy, or he has to come out and fight. If he comes out and when it seems the battle starts out What he starts out by doing is trying to draw Octavian's fleet in, but Octavian refuses to do so. Why? Well, in more confined waters, Octavian has lighter ships, so they are more likely to get drawn into the coast. They're also, if they depend on their freedom of maneuver and their ability to maneuver, for their speed, etc., maneuverability, in order to avoid getting caught by the larger ships, which Antony has. Now, why am I saying larger ships? Well, Octavian's fleet is mostly Quinca Marines and Liburna. Antony's fleet is Quinca Marines, Deca Marines, and all sorts of other larger vessels, mostly. There are a few Quadrimarines going around, there are a few Triremes probably sitting around somewhere in there, but most of them fit in those sort of categories for either side. So you're dealing with a heavy fleet in purple, you're dealing with a lighter fleet in red. And mostly, what we're going to be talking about in terms of their firepower, Agrippa has armed these ships for maximum range engagement. So they are armed with ballistae, which have a range of different weapons to fire, including fire shot, heavy darts, and something else I'll be getting to in a bit, all of which have a factor in terms of this battle. But they rely on maneuver. So Octavian has to wait for Antony to come to him. Okay? That is the thing. The trouble is the very act of coming to him, and especially with the positioning and organization of the fleets, and them getting themselves together and getting themselves launched, means that Antony's forces are going to spread out. And instead of being able to deliver a solid punch, it's going to be spread out across the line, especially the more they go further out into the Aegean, into this water, the more... Adriatic is the side. This is the Ionian Sea, so it's sort of Ionian Adriatic area. Aegean's the other side. Sorry, geography. That's Aegean, that's Adriatic, Ionian. Yeah. More they go out into the Ionian. It's actually on the screen in front of me. I should have just gone with that, but going from memory. More they go out in that, the more... how do I put this? The more they start to suffer. Because they are the traditional warships. And they are the traditional solid line. So think of it like this. You've got a fleet which is made up on one side of heavy cruisers and battleships. But they are heavy cruisers and battleships which are designed for boarding actions and dominating in that method by ramming and boarding. The traditional weaponry. On the other side, you've got enough heavy cruisers and battleships that they are having to be careful of them, but also a large number of destroyers. But all these these ships are armed with ranged weaponry, so they can pepper you, and a lot of it. Both sides have some ranged weaponry. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Antony's fleet didn't have any at all. It had some, just not as much and not as a overabundance of it or focus on it as the fleet which Agrippa had built for Octavian, especially to fight, as he's led against Sextus Pompey in the Sicilian revolt and all that scenario, because that was the way they fought. That was the way they had been trained to fight and started fighting. So they have a difference going on here. Whereas Antony's fleet had mostly been built for showboating and fighting pirates, and basically were in many ways the most legacy fleet going at the battle. So these are some slides from the Battle of Cape Economos video, because I wanted to give you a quick overview, but I didn't want to go into all this again because we've been into all this. So the Battle of Cape Economos video has all this detail in it. And the ram is really the super weapon of the ancient seas. If you get rammed, you got into real trouble. But the Corvus Well, that is part of the ideas going on at the period when boarding really makes sense. And you have to remember the Romans traditionally built their ships heavier than the Carthaginians and other Hellenistic powers had done so, which meant their ships were often less manoeuvrable but more solid. So they could more withstand the impact of being rammed, but more likely to also deliver a heavier ram when they do hit. But that meant they were less manoeuvrable for it. We've got the Byrene, which is, as said, the sort of predecessor in many ways of the Liburna, especially in its structuring of the oars. And the Quinquemarine, which is the solid warship. Now, you've had some ideas come, and there are even some sources I read which are supposedly really well informed, which have ideas of this being the way it was rowed, where you have structured up all these people up there. And I don't see that. I don't see that as likely at all. I do find it interesting once you get to a certain level, because you've also got the angle of the oar involved, and that's got to be a factor. But the angle of the rower has to be a factor. The range of motion, all these things have to be a factor in your consideration for how it's going to play out. And I'm sorry, I'm just trying to turn the light on. And so this is what makes it all complicated to us, and really complicated to us. The thing is, we haven't really found good depictions. No one really had a camera in that period. It's just terrible. Terrible. No one had no one took a photo of their iPhone in 30 BC. I don't know why. It's just terrible. But what we do have is a lot of accounts. So we know in terms of the number of people they were supposed to use. Although this causes fun, because some of the big ones, 4,000 rowers, and you sit there and go, well, let's work this out, okay? Let's work this out. So if we have, it's a double-hulled vessel with platform stretched between two, and we have, let's say, oarsmen on both sides of each of the hulls. So you divide that by 4 immediately, so you got 1,000 on it, on each side. Well, ooh, that's quite a lot. That's quite a lot. Now, you could have 100 oars on each side. That'd be very, very long, though. On each sort of bank, and you'd have 10 oarsmen per, but it's going to be a lot of people. So, there's that. But the thing is, we're far more confident in our understanding of the Quinquemarines, of, well, read these lovely names. The Hexamarine, that's a 6. A Septarine, 7. Octares, Endares, Decares, 10. And you might have heard me also refer to a Decamarine earlier. That is another phrase which is occasionally used by some books to describe the 10 in the Hellenistic navies. It depends on which period, and also, yeah. But it's all interesting history. It's the point I'm trying to make. Now, it's supposed to be when I press. I'm still getting used to doing this with OBS and getting OBS set up. I need to get I want to do it with OBS. I really need to get a Stream Deck. I mean. So, this is the other tool I was talking about earlier for the ballistae. And that is a harpax. And this has been first used, not at Actium. The amount of times I've read, this was first used at the Battle of Actium. No, it wasn't. It was used at the Battle of Nauclus, against the forces of Sextus Pompey in the Sicilian Revolt. And you can understand why, because Sextus lost somewhere in the region of 180 to 300 warships. Approximately 28 of those were lost to traditional ramming. That's roughly in line with most battles between most equivalently trained forces. Again, the Battle of Cape Econos is not a good example for that one, because that wasn't equivalently trained forces. That was an experienced Roman fleet versus a very inexperienced Carthaginian fleet. And roughly 155 by capture and fire. Discrepancies come in some account as to just amount, which is why we have a roughly 180 vessels were lost out of 300. But when you add in 155 to 28, you end up, by my math, with 183. So there is some debate going on there, but not much, not much. Honestly, for sources when you're dealing with them over 2,000 years old, and we're talking actually roughly 2059, so 2060 years ago. The fact you've got it sources which are good enough and credible enough we can give figures to that level is just amazing. Basically, what happens is you're firing what is a giant grappling hook at the enemy, and then you're pulling them into you. Now the thing is, if you have multiple small ships and you surround and attack a larger ship, guess what you can do? You can fire that, you can grapple them, start pulling yourself towards them so that they can't ram you, and you can keep on firing with the ballistae. And if you've got enough ballistae, you can clear Marines off the deck pretty quickly because they take cover. Especially if they start to lose their ballistae. And then you can board. Now, one of the problems for Antony is that the sickness that had been affecting his camp and a lot of his staff had kind of heavily focused, it seems, on his camp of rowers. They had been the ones who had been most affected. And you can argue about this because, well, the legionnaires are probably doing more training every day. The rowers aren't necessarily rowing their ships every day, and especially when they're staying ashore, they are therefore probably not moving around as much, and whilst they might be doing some things to keeping active, etc., whenever you've got people sitting around a lot more, they tend to spread sickness far more quickly. It's one of the things is that when we look at troops throughout history, in terms of disease, it's rare that troops which are marching and organising and moving have illness. It's always in camp, it's always when they're in siege, where they've been stationary for a long period of time, where they aren't being active. Why? Because A, one of the best ways of getting rid of disease is leaving it behind you for someone else to deal with. And B, being fit, active, healthy, it's good for you. Which is a big surprise. So, now, there is a problem with some of these pictures, okay? For starters, that's a hexamarine, so that's a 6. So that's a 2-2-2 of the oarsman. Or possibly a 3-3 of the oarsman. We're never quite sure. With a lot of the even-numbered ones, it is tempting. It is tempting to think that they might be, especially with 6 and 4, I think they might be just doubling up the oarsman on the bireme design or the, that sort of thing. It comes to something interesting once you're dealing with the 8 vessels, because honestly, they're probably 3-3-2. But a lot of people trying to go, well, maybe they're 4-4s. The trouble is, once you're dealing with a 4th person on the oar, that gets a lot more complicated. It starts making the naval architecture far more complicated than necessarily you need it to be, if you want to build a ship quickly. But yes, this is a Quinca Marine, how it would sort of look like. You see you've got some towers there to provide positions for the archers. You've got ballistae. it's a lovely ship. And then you've got Liburna up there, which has, its two banks of oars. They are designed to have more space for each oarsman, so they can do the full range of motion, which is good. Full range of motion is always good. That allows you to do more. And, well, they are smaller, faster. In a battle between them and a Quinquemarine solo, if the Quinquemarine manages to use its size and gut them into a confined space where they can't maneuver against them, it will squash them. If, however, you have multiple Liburnae versus a single Quinquemarine because it gets split off because of the way the water is flowing and because of the way the battle is going, then, well, like any large combat system versus multiple smaller combat systems of similar technological capability, it tends to get defeated in detail. Because it can focus itself on one. Well, while it's attempting to clobber one, the other 5 are beating the out of it. And that seems to be a lot of the battle. Does seem to be, and if we go back to the previous slide, does seem to be that. A lot of the battle seems to be Antony's been forced to go forward. He presses the northern fleet very hard, but his ships start to get split off. They launch their attacks and they charge in, and the Liburnae maneuver out, and whilst the Quinquemarines are trying to focus on other Quinquemarines and they are getting multiple Liburnae coming around them, and combined with the ballistae effect and the fact that they can't really get their rams in on these ships because they are drawing themselves into their sides and various other things, and are especially using their speed to try and take out their oars, all this has a factor. And by the time Cleopatra's ships are in a position to start interfering, Cleopatra seems to realize quite quickly that the battle is not going well, and decides to get out of there. I always love when people say they retreated to the open sea without engaging, in terms of Cleopatra. If we go back to this sort of position, the open sea is through Octavian's line. I don't think necessarily retreating to the open sea makes sense as a phraseology. I would suggest that maybe what you have is the ships which can form up and break out do manage to break out as they plan to do. And I think the thing is, Cleopatra's force, as it's the one at the rear and it's the heavier ships, because of the fighting, the gap's made, they're going through it, and everyone else is supposed to follow, but they can't disengage. That would sound to me a more appropriate to the scenario phraseology. But never get that and let a more appropriate phraseology for the scenario get in the way of good propaganda. And the trouble is, the propagandists had several thousand years to work it through, and no one really got too much into the arguing at the time, because, let's be honest, Octavian had won, and what Octavian wanted to be his battle scenario would be his battle scenario. So with all that said, let's consider the building of the ships. Now, one of the problems you have, again, when you're talking about Roman fleets is that they have a tradition of being built rather quickly. This might again explain why we have so little knowledge of the building process. Or rather, what knowledge we do have of the building process is quite a lot of us going, how the frigate did they do that? Well, people are forgetting 2 things. One, you don't need a lot of master craftsmen if you are building these ships. You need enough to oversee it. But if you have a lot of quite fit, healthy workers who have a fairly decent basic knowledge of what they're doing, you can produce a lot very quickly. And what do I mean by basic knowledge? Well, consider this. Working with wood is going to be far more of a cultural norm of knowledge in this period than it is even in the 18th centuries. There are going to be far more people far more used to working with wood. Why? Because everything you do has to come with wood. Everything. Wood is the universal tool. So most people, especially the vast majority of the people who are going to be your soldiery and your sailors, are going to have some knowledge. So that's a massive workforce who are capable of using a saw, who are capable of hammering in nails, who are capable of doing the necessary functions. So you have a huge workforce. You have some core experts who know what they're doing. And then you add in a factor of they're not really worried about the life of these ships. These ships aren't supposed to be around for a long time. They're not going to be around for years. Well, maybe they'll do a couple of years. But they're not really being... When they're building these fleets, especially the rapidly built ships, fleets of ships, which are usually just smaller vessels, they are not building them for the long term. They're also building them for the Mediterranean, which is different. Okay? If you're building something to cross the Atlantic, you're going to build it very differently than if you're building something just to go into the Mediterranean. My major problem with the rapid construction of ships is actually the bronze. It's not the wood, it's not the building the ships themselves, it's the bronze for the very heavy bronze, which is used for their rams. And again, that's something which nations at this period, as we're going to call them nations or civilizations, tend to be quite careful about keeping hold of their rams between ships. B, they have a rather large infrastructure and logistics system around providing aforementioned rams. And C, the ram is often the important thing you capture off an opponent, and if anything survives in your fleet for years after you fought a battle, it's going to be the rams you nicked off the enemy. This is why, though, we have facts like, the Romans built and equipped a fleet of 220 vessels in 45 days for the purpose of resisting the attacks of Hera, king of the Syracuse. And during the Second Punic War, Scipio put to sea a fleet which was often stated, I've put there, and it's often stated, to have been completed in 40 days from the time the timber was felled. However, that's not quite the case of the fleets at Actium. We go, they were rapidly built. No, they weren't. They had been amassed over the previous couple of years, at least, maybe even slightly longer. Some of their ships were certainly older. Especially the bigger ships usually have a lot more effort. It's one of the things of, again, we talk about seasoning, okay, of hulls. Well, galleys were quite often, even some of the quite large galleys, seem to have been, in effect, pulled out of the water and dry docked. Sometimes even dismantled, and their components could be individually put between different galleys between their uses. If they were survived and, we don't need ships anymore, well, okay, we'll dismantle them and put them on one side. So the whole thing about seasoning, well, yes and no. They don't seem to necessarily season wood before they use it to construct galleys, but that doesn't mean that the galleys themselves, the wood on them, doesn't go through, in effect, a version of seasoning on the galley. Also, again, if you're taking ships out of the water, you're dismantling them, or you're doing other things with them, that's going to affect, again, that's going to have an impact on the way the hull wears out and wears through. So, yeah, these are differences. There is also an interesting point that some authors have made on terms of construction of ships, in that they make a big fuss about how the navies the navies and sort of a lot of the people constructing ships at the time make a big thing about when, in the phase of the moon, you cut the trees. So I'm putting it had to be exactly on the 17th day of the moon's age. Most seem to settle when it's we need to build a large number of ships in a hurry. 15th to 23rd will work. Day of the moon. Because of the sap. I would say, for the style of construction, what I would categorize as, well, they tend to have a false keel to allow them to be drawn up onto the beaches. Their proper keel, and then another false keel which is used for inserting the masts. They tend to have a version of ribbing coming from the keel that allows you to then put planks over it to create the hull, and then you cork between the planks. Cork system does change at various points. It starts off as honestly crushed seashells, and eventually they work it through to including all sorts of things. But pretty much the problem with crushed seashells is that it's a lovely idea and should in many ways work as a bit of a glue, but it needs some fibre in it to make it hold, and so you need to add in flax or horsehair or various other things are suitable. Now, the thing is, when you're constructing even a quinquerine, you can do that fairly quickly and fairly competently with those materials. Once you're building something bigger, and this is the point, is that Antony had roughly 140 ships available for Actium. He'd shown up with a force of, it was presumed to be around 500 ships originally. But A, that number probably included a large number of merchant store ships. B, sickness. Again, it's often put down to desertion. Plutarch and Dio both focus on desertion, but they also do mention the seas quite heavily. I'd say desertion sounds better from the Octavian propaganda perspective, but disease sounds more realistic to me. Especially considering the time Antony had been there, how long supplies will survive in that period with their various processes of preservation, etc. And his ships were mainly quinquerines, which meant they will have been quite large, quite capable. But he and his flagship, his admirals, were all 10. I.e., they're all deckers or deckerines. Antony's ships were therefore quite large, and were supposed to be therefore be able to rain their missiles and things onto the small ships. However, those ships, those bigger ships, take a long time to build. And a large number of Cleopatra ships are the bigger, even are quinquerines or even hexamarines. They're bigger, they're capable vessels. So those take longer to build, okay, because they're more complicated. They have more of an internal structure. You have to do more thinking out about exactly how you're going to get these oars to work. And yes, once you know, you know. But if we expand this, and you start looking at some of these things, and this is from that excellent book which I pointed out earlier, you start looking at it going, hang on, look at the various positions those oarsmen are in, and those oars could quite sort of easily get into trouble. You have the 3-3-4 approach, you have the 3-4-3 approach, you have the 5-5 approach. You could also, in theory, have had a 4-4-3 approach. But that would be really interesting, especially when you look at the arc of the arc of the well, as put it, the arc of the oar. It's gonna be an interesting time. My personal thinking out of all of that is that I don't think 5 to an oar makes a lot of sense in terms of actual person being the fifth person being able to put in a lot of power. length of the oar is going to be massive, and basically you're going to have one person who's barely moving at the closest point to the oar, and the person at the end who's basically running. That doesn't really work for me. The 3-3-4 approach could work, as could the 3-4-3. I would say of the ones illustrated, the 3-4-3 makes the most sense to me. But it could well be a 4-3-3. And that does sound like football team analogies for American viewers' soccer. Anyway, so to do all that, to work, to position the ship which is larger, that takes longer. Okay, so those ships are going to have been built a lot longer before the battle than the smaller ships. They will take in more effort and more naval architecture, because again, when you're dealing with a quinquereme, even a hexareme, you're basically dealing with something which is an evolution of the trireme. It's been around for a very, very long time, and you built a lot of them. You're talking hundreds at times. That means you have a lot of knowledge to build those from. When you're building the bigger ships, they've always been the flagships, the status ships, and it tends to be that people who build them are building them for their status more than their actual fighting power. They are the equivalent of the battleships in the 1890s, which have 16¼ inch guns. Great, you have a 16¼ inch gun. What can you do with it? Well, not much, and we'll probably be shredded by 6-inch guns at the range we're engaged. Okay, but we have a 16¼ inch gun, so yeah. So, the fleets of Actium. It's an interesting battle. I hope I've covered enough about the battle to give you a bit of an idea of it. I haven't gone into massive detail because it's more about the building and the politics that goes around the building of them. And I wanted to talk more about the ships in this period as I talked about the ships in the Battle of Iconos, which I think I talked about last year in 2022. The big thing about this battle you have to remember is that it is the smaller Liburna vessels which are the crucial ace in Octavian's fleet and in Agrippa's plan. But they only work if Antony comes out to them. And Antony only comes out to them if he has to. He only comes out to fight if he absolutely has to. And that's something you have to think about. Because, as I put in this scenario, if we again go back to it again, it is a balanced fleet versus a heavy fleet. Antony had the more powerful fleet, especially at the beginning. By the time of the battle, Octavian has 260 ships there, Antony has 140, but Antony probably still has the advantage in large ships. Antony still will have, because his ships are mostly the large ships. Octavian has a lot more of ships though, and most of them are the far smaller ships. Now, one of the things you might have noticed is I've been actually rather quiet when it comes to numbers of people involved, and I've left it right to the end. That's because you have some really interesting stats going around. You have the fact that at a point, Octavian seems to have turned up with roughly 400 vessels. And of those, roughly 260 seem to actually be warships, and the rest probably transports, etc., and supply ships. He's carrying roughly 19,000 troops aboard those 260 ships, plus 19,000, of which 16,000 infantry and 3,000 archers, and it'll be the infantry manning the ballistae. So, you know, okay, that's fairly large numbers. Mark Antony. So, well, it starts off when I might have used the figure 140 already. There are roughly 140 ships which he groups into his 3 groups. Sometimes it's referred to roughly as 180. 140 to 180. That he forms up into his 3 groups. And then Cleopatra has a further 60. So that makes roughly 240. Roughly. And sometimes we get the figure roughly 250 ships. Actually goes sea, and he had between 30 and 50 transports already as sort of in there as well, and possibly more ships. However, here is a problem. He's supposedly got 20,000 infantry and 2,000 archers on those ships, so he's got far fewer, he's got roughly comparable numbers of ships, it seems, in a way, because you've got 250 versus 260, but he's got fewer archers. And we know, we sort of get all sort of battle figures, and basically Cleopatra ships don't take part in the battle. They don't get there in time, and they then go for or as already discussed, fight their way through, as I'm going to discuss in a minute. But the whole thing is, it gets rather interesting, because you also have the figures of the troops who are ashore, and there's debates over who's involved in what battle. I would say myself, roughly, you probably have 140-ish, 140, 150-ish ships in Antony's fleet that actually engage Octavians, and it's roughly 260 ships in terms of Octavians. Roughly. But would I want to bet money on that? Depends how much. A fiver? Yeah. 500? Probably not. Mainly because that's the cost of photos at the moment, and I've got a... that's the cost of rights and rights to use and publish a single photo at the moment, and frankly, that's a lot of money. But yeah, but that's, the numbers aren't the only the numbers in terms of the list of numbers of the fleets they have aren't the interesting area of where numbers start to come in and seem a bit strange. There are some really interesting figures, though, in terms of the numbers of ships which are sometimes sunk. Sometimes you get figures which are the entirety of Mark Antony's fleet is sunk. We know that wasn't the case, because we know Cleopatra got away with at least 60 in her group. At least 60. So that's not going to have happened. And Antony gets away with some of his ships as well. So for an entire fleet to be sunk, that would be an interesting occurrence, if they also managed to get away. So what's the question? Because I always finish videos with a question, and I'm not going to discontinue that practice with this one. Well, this is a battle between, I would argue, a balanced fleet versus a heavy fleet. But it can easily be swept aside because people go, well, it's galley warfare. Doesn't have any bearing to modern ships. And if we consider things like the Lanchester rules, which are used for defining like projected casualties and projected winners of battles, which I'm going to do a proper video about at some point, but because I'm not in 100% agreement with them. But they have the linear law for pre-gun battles, and they have the square law for the moment you have sort of firearms, which I find really, really funny when you consider that the person who came up with it comes from Britain, which of course spent most of its time winning medieval battles thanks to archers, often outnumbered. But please note, I'm not saying it's universally bad, it's not, it's got some very good ideas in it, but there are factors in it which I don't like. And there are reasons, and I'll explain that in a video about that. But the point is, because you have these different laws, people then go, well, that not the period cannot apply because we use a different scientific methodology for understanding battles in the modern era. I don't think so. I think, and I would argue, that fleet structures and building balanced forces is a universal in terms of the capabilities it gives you. And what this battle to me has always illustrated, and I'm making my own view on this point, there are many other historians who disagree with me, is that if you have a heavy fleet force, be wary about getting tied down to one location. Because the moment you're tied down in a space where you can't concentrate your force and you can't select when to fight a battle that suits you, you have a problem. Especially if you're fighting someone who has a balanced fleet and is able to use maneuver and force you to come out to them. Force you to fight a battle which suits them. So, what's the question going to be? The question is going to be whether you think fleet structure and formation, in terms of being a heavy fleet or a balanced fleet, etc., or a light fleet, matters more, or the ability to choose your engagement to suit you. As, well, Agrippa basically carried on the same kind of fighting he'd already been doing against Antony's fleet. So the fact is, Octavian basically just sits there and goes, "Yes, what, Agrippa? How should we fight this battle? Yeah, carry on. We will fight the battle the way he just said, but it's my idea." It's brilliant. Anyway, and by the way, that does not take anything from Octavian. Sometimes when I say that about everything, people look at me and go, "Oh, you're just hating on Octavian or Augustus." No, I'm not. One of the best things a leader can do is go, "Hang on, I'm not the smartest person in the room when it comes to X, Y, or Z. That person is. Let's hear their idea. If I like it, let's do it." That's actually being a very good leader. That's actually more props to Octavian. Not saying he's not good or capable at what he does. It's saying he realised his weakness and he had someone who was pretty good at the job. And let's be honest, Marcus Agrippa, I have to say this, loved war. He was never not fighting. If he was happy, he was fighting. It was what he lived for. He was very good at it. You didn't want him anywhere near civilian administration, but you sent him off to war. He was excellent. Using the skills at your disposal as a leader, that's the good thing. So I've got coming up next week. Capital ships of science fiction. Battle Stars versus Star Destroyers. I'm looking forward to that one. It's going to be a completely random one, but yeah. And I know I have announced those already on the live on Sunday evening, and I've forgotten to update the slide. But thank you very much for watching, and there will be a live on Thursday. Take care. Have a nice evening. I hope you enjoyed. And as ever, thank you very much for your support. And what's the phrase which one of the people I watch a lot on YouTube says? Oh yes, please do like and subscribe if you would like the channel to grow. Because I'd like the channel to grow. I really would at the moment. It's contract renewal time for universities in the UK, and some of them are weird. Enjoy and good luck to all my colleagues who are also going through the same process. Remember, look at the footnotes carefully. They do sneak some things in there. Parking fees have gone up dramatically. Anyway, that's off the topic. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed.